Paul McCartney, one of the most famous names in music, was born James Paul McCartney on June 18, 1942, in Liverpool, England. He came into the world during World War II, when the city of Liverpool was still facing bombing raids, and families were living with fear and hardship. His father, Jim, was a jazz pianist and trumpet player who loved music, and his mother, Mary, was a kind and hard-working midwife. The McCartney family lived in a modest home, not rich by any means, but filled with love and a strong sense of values. Paul grew up surrounded by music. His father often played piano at home, and he encouraged Paul to listen to many different styles, from classical and traditional British songs to the new American jazz and swing records that were becoming popular. This exposure to many types of music shaped Paul's ear from an early age. But life was not always easy. When Paul was only 14 years old, tragedy struck his family. His mother, Mary, passed away from cancer. The loss left Paul heartbroken, and it gave him a sense of emotional depth and sadness that would later appear in many of his songs. In interviews, Paul has admitted that this event shaped his ability to write songs that touch people's hearts, because he knew what it meant to feel pain and longing. Not long after, when Paul was about 15, he met another teenager who would change his life forever, John Lennon. They met at a small local event, a church fete, where John was playing with his skiffle group, the Quarrymen. Skiffle was a type of simple folk and rock music that was popular in Britain at the time. Paul was introduced to John by a friend, and after hearing Paul play guitar and sing, John quickly realized he had found someone with serious talent. The two young men bonded immediately over their shared love of American rock and roll. They listened to records by Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and of course, Ricky Nelson. At that time, most British teenagers were fascinated with the exciting new sounds coming from the United States, and Paul and John were no exception. Soon, Paul joined John's band, and the two started writing songs together. That partnership would go on to become one of the most famous in music history. The Quarrymen eventually evolved into the Beatles, with George Harrison and Ringo Starr joining the lineup. By the early 1960s, the Beatles were on their way to changing the world. With Paul's melodic bass playing, his smooth voice, and his talent for songwriting, the Beatles quickly stood out from other bands. Paul's style was different. While many rock musicians leaned toward shouting or aggressive styles, Paul often used melody, emotion, and a softer tone when needed. This balance came partly from his admiration of Ricky Nelson, who had shown that a singer could be powerful without being loud. Paul would later admit that Nelson's ability to sing in a calm yet emotional way made him realize that pop music could carry real feelings. The Beatles' career was short but incredibly powerful. From 1960 to 1970, they went from playing clubs in Liverpool and Hamburg to becoming the biggest band on the planet. With songs like Yesterday, Hey Jude, Blackbird, and Let It Be, Paul helped write music that touched millions of people. His melodic bass lines were innovative, his songwriting was versatile, and his voice carried everything from rock energy to gentle ballads. The Beatles also pushed the boundaries of what popular music could be. Albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and Revolver introduced orchestral sounds, experimental techniques, and psychedelic textures into rock and roll. Paul was often the driving force behind these experiments, pushing the group to try new ideas. But even as Beatlemania exploded, Paul never forgot the artists who had influenced him in his teenage years. Among them, Ricky Nelson stood out. Ricky was a different kind of star. He wasn't just a singer, he grew up on television, acting in his family's show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Unlike Elvis, who embodied rebellion and raw energy, Ricky's charm came from his softer, more emotional style. Songs like Lonesome Town showed vulnerability, a side of rock and roll that wasn't always common at the time. Paul has said that this made a big impression on him. It showed him that a pop song didn't just have to be about fun or dancing, it could carry sadness, loneliness, and deep feelings that touched the listener in a personal way. When the Beatles broke up in 1970, Paul could have faded into history, but instead he launched another successful phase of his career. He formed Wings with his wife, Linda McCartney, and created hits like Band on the Run, Live and Let Die, Jet, and Silly Love Songs. His career after the Beatles showed that he was not only one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century, but also one of the most resilient. Decade after decade, Paul reinvented himself. He collaborated with Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, Kanye West, and Rihanna, bridging generations and proving his music was timeless. He even composed classical pieces, electronic music, and film scores, showing his wide creative range. But while Paul was busy building his legacy, Ricky Nelson was living a very different story. Though he was one of the first teen idols and had sold millions of records, he often felt trapped by his image. Unlike the Beatles, who fought to take control of their music, Ricky sometimes found himself boxed in by the commercial machine around him. Paul later admitted that watching Ricky's struggles reminded him how important it was for artists to control their own path. The Beatles had refused to be limited to pop love songs. They demanded the freedom to grow, and Paul knew how lucky they were to have that power. Nelson, unfortunately, often didn't. By the 1980s, Paul's own life was full of challenges. He struggled with personal loss, legal troubles, and the tragic murder of his close friend John Lennon. Yet through it all, he kept making music, kept touring, and kept evolving. By contrast, Ricky Nelson's life ended far too early when he died in a tragic plane crash in 1985, at only 45 years old. Paul later said it was heartbreaking to lose someone who had meant so much to him as an influence. He even revealed that he had once thought about reaching out to Ricky for a collaboration but never did, something he still regrets. At age 83, Paul McCartney finally opened up about his deep respect for Ricky Nelson, explaining how Nelson's emotional style influenced him as a songwriter and performer. For Paul, Ricky wasn't just another singer, he was a blueprint of how to balance fame, vulnerability, and artistry, even if Ricky himself didn't always get the recognition he deserved. When people look back at the history of rock and roll, Ricky Nelson's name sometimes doesn't get mentioned as often as Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, or Little Richard. Yet to a young Paul McCartney growing up in Liverpool in the 1950s, Ricky Nelson was just as important. Nelson was born in 1940 in New Jersey, and by the time he was a teenager, he was already in the spotlight thanks to his family's television show, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. His parents, Ozzie and Harriet Nelson, were actors and musicians who created the series to showcase their family life, and Ricky became a household name long before he even started singing. By the time he picked up a guitar and performed songs on the show, millions of young fans were watching. This gave him a platform that no other young singer had at the time, and almost overnight, Ricky Nelson became one of America's first true teen idols. But unlike some child stars who fade quickly, Ricky had real talent. His voice was smooth, natural, and emotional. He had the kind of delivery that made a listener feel like he was singing directly to them. Songs like Poor Little Fool, Travelin' a Man, and Lonesome Town weren't just catchy, they carried a sincerity that was rare in the early days of rock and roll. To Paul McCartney, this was inspiring. He later recalled sitting by the radio as a teenager in Liverpool, waiting for American broadcasts and records to arrive. For him, Ricky's voice was different from the others. Elvis was powerful and magnetic, Jerry Lee Lewis was wild and loud, but Ricky was calm, soulful, and full of feeling. It made Paul realize that you didn't have to shout to make people listen. Sometimes, a soft voice with emotion could move people even more. This lesson stayed with McCartney. When he started writing songs with John Lennon, he brought that sensitivity into the Beatles' music. While Lennon often leaned toward sharp, rebellious lyrics, Paul would balance it with melody and heart. Think of Yesterday, with its gentle sadness, or Blackbird, with its simple beauty. These weren't just rock songs, they were emotional experiences. And behind that was the influence of singers like Ricky Nelson, who had shown Paul that pop music could be honest, tender, and deeply human. Paul often admitted that Ricky's 1958 ballad Lonesome Town was one of the songs that hit him the hardest. The way Ricky sang about loneliness and isolation struck Paul deeply. He said that sometimes, when he was young, hearing that song would bring tears to his eyes. It wasn't just music to him, it was a lesson in how to connect with people's feelings through song. This emotional side of Nelson's music would later echo in Paul's own work with songs like The Long and Winding Road. But while Ricky Nelson inspired Paul, his life was also a warning. Unlike the Beatles, who had more control over their music, Ricky was often pushed by the industry to stay in a certain image. His parents' TV show had made him famous as the clean-cut, good-looking boy next door, and many record companies and managers wanted to keep him that way. This made it hard for Ricky to break free and experiment the way the Beatles did. Paul later reflected that this was one of the sad parts of Ricky's story. He had the talent to do more, but the system around him kept him boxed in. As the Beatles rose to global fame in the 1960s, Paul could see the differences between their journey and Ricky's. The Beatles had screaming fans just like Ricky did, but they pushed back against being trapped in one role. They stopped touring at the height of their fame, deciding instead to focus on studio work that allowed them to experiment and grow. Songs like A Day in the Life, Strawberry Fields Forever, and Eleanor Rigby proved that they could reinvent themselves. Ricky, on the other hand, often struggled to escape the teen idol label, even though he wanted to be taken seriously as a musician. Paul later said he always felt empathy for Nelson because he understood the pressures of fame, but he also admired Ricky's persistence in continuing to perform and create despite the limitations he faced. Ricky Nelson did have later success, especially with his 1972 hit Garden Party, a song about being true to yourself even when others don't understand you. In the song, Nelson told the story of performing at Madison Square Garden, where fans only wanted to hear his old hits and not his newer music. The message of the song, "You can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself," resonated with many musicians, including Paul. McCartney understood what it meant to grow older in the music industry, where fans often want you to stay the same, even as you change as a person and artist. For Paul, Garden Party showed Ricky's maturity and honesty, proving he wasn't just a teen idol but a true songwriter with something important to say. Tragically, Ricky's story ended too soon. On December 31, 1985, Ricky Nelson died in a plane crash while traveling to a concert. He was only 45 years old. The news shocked the music world and saddened fans everywhere. For Paul, it was a painful reminder of how fragile life could be. He later admitted that Ricky's death hit him hard, because he had always wanted to reach out to him. At one point in the early 1980s, Paul thought about collaborating with Ricky, believing their musical styles could blend beautifully. But he never followed through, something he deeply regrets. He has said in interviews, "I always thought we had a certain musical kinship, but time has a way of slipping through your fingers." By speaking about Ricky Nelson later in life, Paul highlighted something important: the connections between artists across generations. Even though they came from different backgrounds, one a British working-class boy, the other an American TV star, they shared a bond through music. Ricky's songs gave Paul lessons in melody, emotion, and honesty. And in turn, Paul carried those lessons into the Beatles, into Wings, and into his long solo career. Without Ricky, Paul's songwriting might have sounded very different. At the same time, Paul has always been open about how he saw Ricky's struggles as a warning. It reminded him never to let the industry completely define who he was. For Paul, staying in control of his creativity was essential, and he credits part of that determination to watching how Ricky was sometimes boxed in by others' expectations. In this way, Ricky was not only an influence but also a guide, showing Paul both the possibilities and the dangers of fame. As Paul McCartney entered his later years, he continued to honor Ricky Nelson's memory. At 83, when he finally opened up fully about Ricky, it wasn't just about admiration, it was about gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons, for the inspiration, and for the reminder that music is about honesty above all else. By paying tribute to Ricky, Paul was also reminding the world that even artists who may not always get the spotlight they deserve still shape the music we love in profound ways. When Paul McCartney turned 83, the world celebrated him as one of the greatest living musicians, a legend whose songs had touched billions of lives. But behind the fame, Paul often showed a humble side, remembering the artists who had shaped him before the Beatles ever took the stage. At this age, his reflections became deeper, more personal, and more emotional. One of the names he returned to, surprisingly but sincerely, was Ricky Nelson. For Paul, Ricky wasn't just another singer from the 1950s, he was someone whose music had seeped into his very soul when he was a teenager, someone who helped him find his own voice. By speaking about Ricky so openly at 83, Paul wasn't just honoring a childhood hero, he was also reconciling with his own past, facing his regrets, and acknowledging how much he owed to a man who often doesn't get enough credit in rock history. Paul admitted in interviews that Ricky Nelson's story had always haunted him. Unlike Elvis, who had been larger than life, Ricky was quiet, approachable, and deeply emotional in his performances. This made him relatable, but it also meant he was more vulnerable to being overlooked or controlled by others. Paul said that when he was young, he often dreamed of one day meeting Ricky, maybe even writing a song together. In the 1970s and 1980s, when Paul was enjoying success with Wings and later in his solo career, Ricky was still performing, often to smaller crowds, but still pouring his heart into the music. Paul thought many times about reaching out, about calling him or arranging a studio session, but life always seemed to get in the way. Touring, family, business struggles, and the constant demands of fame kept pushing that dream further down the road. Then, when Ricky tragically died in that plane crash in 1985, Paul was left with nothing but regret. He later confessed that it hurt him to think he had waited too long. "I always thought there would be time," Paul said, "but time has a way of disappearing." This sense of regret carried a powerful message, not just for Paul but for anyone listening. At 83, he used Ricky's memory as a reminder about the importance of acting on your feelings before it's too late. Whether it's reaching out to a friend, pursuing a creative idea, or simply saying thank you to someone who inspired you, Paul understood that hesitation can lead to a lifetime of wondering, what if? In his speeches and interviews, he gently encouraged younger artists not to hold back their gratitude or their ambitions. In many ways, Paul was teaching through his own pain, showing that even a man who wrote some of the greatest songs in history still carried personal regrets. But regret was not the only thing Paul felt when talking about Ricky Nelson. He also expressed deep gratitude. He credited Ricky with teaching him about melody and emotion, lessons that helped shape songs like Michelle, Yesterday, and Let It Be. Paul explained that while John Lennon often brought a raw edge and rebellious spirit to their songwriting partnership, he himself leaned on melody and tenderness, something he had learned from listening to Ricky's smooth vocals and heartfelt delivery. In this way, Ricky Nelson became part of the Beatles' DNA, even if fans didn't always realize it. Paul's acknowledgement at 83 was, in a way, setting the record straight, reminding the world that behind every famous band, there are hidden influences who deserve recognition. Paul also admired Ricky's courage later in life, especially with the release of Garden Party. That song, with its message about staying true to yourself even when the world wants you to repeat the past, spoke directly to Paul's own journey. After the Beatles broke up, Paul faced enormous pressure and criticism. Many fans and critics wanted him to either reform the Beatles or keep making the same kind of music forever. But like Ricky, Paul insisted on moving forward, even when it wasn't popular. He tried different styles, worked with new bands, and refused to become a museum piece of the 1960s. When Paul listened to Garden Party, he felt a sense of kinship, two artists, from two different countries, both struggling with the same challenge of growing older in a world that prefers you frozen in time. At 83, Paul also spoke about the spiritual side of Ricky's music. He said that when he listens to Ricky's old songs now, he doesn't just hear the recordings, he feels the moments of his own youth coming back. He remembers sitting with his guitar in Liverpool, trying to copy Ricky's chords, and dreaming of one day writing songs that could move people the same way. Those memories weren't just about music, they were about hope, ambition, and the magic of being young. Ricky Nelson became part of Paul's personal soundtrack, a thread woven through his entire life. By revisiting those songs in his later years, Paul was reconnecting with the boy he once was, the boy who believed that music could change everything. More than anything, Paul McCartney's reflections on Ricky Nelson at 83 revealed the humanity behind the fame. Here was a man celebrated as a knight of the British Empire, a global icon, a billionaire musician, admitting that he still looked back with longing and unfinished feelings. It showed that no matter how high you rise, the simplest things, like wishing you had told someone how much they meant to you, remain the most powerful. This honesty made Paul's words about Ricky not just a tribute but a universal lesson about life, love, and time. In the end, Paul McCartney's bond with Ricky Nelson can be seen as both inspiration and warning. Ricky gave Paul the tools to shape his music, the melodies that touched the world, and the courage to sing from the heart. But Ricky's struggles with fame also reminded Paul to guard his freedom, to never let the industry define him completely. And Ricky's untimely death taught him that opportunities can vanish in an instant. These three lessons, inspiration, caution, and urgency, stayed with Paul for decades, and at 83, he finally put them into words, offering the world a rare glimpse into his deepest feelings. By speaking out, Paul also gave Ricky Nelson something precious: recognition. For years, Ricky was often remembered as just a teen idol or a television star. But in Paul's eyes, he was much more. He was a real musician, a songwriter with heart, and a voice that shaped the sound of generations. Coming from Paul McCartney, one of the greatest artists of all time, this acknowledgement gave Ricky's legacy new weight. Fans who might not have known much about Ricky were suddenly curious, going back to rediscover songs like Lonesome Town, Travelin' Man, and Garden Party. In this way, Paul ensured that Ricky's influence would live on, not just in his own music, but in the hearts of new listeners. And so, at 83, Paul McCartney closed the circle. He began as a boy inspired by Ricky Nelson's records, he grew into a man whose songs defined an era, and in his later years, he looked back with gratitude, love, and a little sadness for what might have been. But perhaps that sadness made the story even more powerful. Because in remembering Ricky, Paul wasn't just telling the story of another artist, he was also telling us something about himself, about the journey of an artist, and about the fragile beauty of life. Ricky Nelson may have left the world too soon, but through Paul McCartney's voice, his spirit continued to sing.